work that I do, but in the context of what could be done here in Ghana. And I come literally just from my meeting with the president and the vice president. And the reason I established this governance initiative is very, very simple. It's that I did these 10 years in government, and I learned a lot from it. I mean, one of the things that's very strange about government is that you're not allowed to say what is true. I don't mean that just generally, but I mean in this context, that I remember when I first came into government, and after about a year, I wanted to go out and make a speech and say to people, look, you know, I'm kind of learning at this thing. You know, it'll get better as it goes on. And, you know, my press people, unsurprisingly, said, if you say that, people are going to panic in the country. Everyone thinks you know what you're doing. But the truth about government is that it's both very complex, very difficult, and it's completely different from campaigning to be government. And I was just saying with the president now, I reminded him of the statement which I always quote from Mario Cuomo, who was the governor of New York, and he said that in politics, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And it's absolutely true. So out of the 10 years, I came to realize that there were certain lessons in how you governed, in the methodology of governing, that apply virtually whatever the country's circumstances and irrespective of any ideology, left, right, center, wherever you are. And in my second term in office, I then changed the way that the center of government worked, better to reflect what I thought was the central challenge which I discovered about governing, which is the challenge of implementation. In other words, taking a vision and turning it into a reality. And it's the clash between rhetoric and reality that is the single most difficult thing about governing. And so what I try to do now is to distill those lessons, including the reforms of structure at the center of government, in order that, frankly, that newly elected presidents and prime ministers can go up the learning curve faster because they're taking advantage of my mistakes. Right? And, you know, these are basically, I'll just outline them for you. These are the lessons that I learned, and then we can have a discussion about it. But the very first thing about government is how you actually organize the infrastructure around the decision maker. This seems completely ridiculous or trivial as a point. But actually, we often do an analysis for the new presidents or prime ministers we work on, which we measure this. What are their priorities? And when it comes to their schedule, how much of their time do they spend on their priorities? And it's unbelievable how little time they actually spend on their priorities. Because here's the thing about governing. Everyone wants to see you. You've got interest groups. You've got constituents. You've got foreign dignitaries. You've got all manner of different people you've got to see, things you've got to do. You've got your protocol. And I always say to people, and the first things I say to any new president is a happy protocol is the sign of a bad government. Because these guys, happy protocol is the sign of a bad government. These guys would always have you meetings from the early morning to the late at night. Governance is about execution. It's about getting things done. And if you're spending all your time just chatting, then you're spending all your time on the politics and not really on the policy delivery. So that's the first thing. How do you create a proper infrastructure around it? It seems trivial, but actually is absolutely fundamental. Second thing is, there is one big advantage today in government, which is around the world, people are facing the same problems. So people in Ghana may think that the issues to do with power infrastructure or education, or agricultural smallholders, or how do you get foreign investment into the country, or how do you balance the budget, you may think these are specifically Ghanaian problems. They're not. Lots of countries have the same problems, different circumstances, but basically the same types of question arise. And the thing about government today is you can learn the best lessons from around the world. Some people are doing it well, some people are doing it badly. There is an experience, accumulated experience, in the profession of governance where lessons can be learned and distilled. And, you know, the important thing is to realize that I would say today the single most important determinant of a country's success is the quality of its governance. Because everything else is mobile. But that's the thing that's either working in the country or is not. So let me give you some examples of countries that are right next door to each other, same resources, roughly same population, therefore same opportunities. One succeeds, one fails. Colombia and Venezuela. Okay. One doing well, one a basket case. Right. Poland and Ukraine. One now successful part of the European Union, the other struggling, as we know. Here in Africa, Rwanda and Burundi. Okay. And the greatest experiment in governance the world has ever seen, which is on the Korean Peninsula, North and South Korea. Okay. So what is the difference in each case? The difference is how it's governed. So the point is today, the best ideas are there. They just have to be accessed. Thirdly, when you then come to certain specifics, these lessons are very clear. Investment. It's absolutely clear what works and what doesn't. Predictable rules, transparently applied, with the minimum bureaucracy. If you want business to come, in those circumstances, they'll come. If you put a whole lot of bureaucracy in place, if there's corruption, if people think that they can't get a proper answer out of government, make things work, they're not going to come. And by the way, today, there's billions and billions of dollars of footloose capital searching for places to invest. So those countries that set their stall out properly on investment can get that money. Fourth, today more than ever before, infrastructure matters. Now, infrastructure has always mattered. It's always helpful to have proper transport systems. It's always a good idea to have the right rail and road and airport. It's always been a good idea to have as much electricity as possible. But today, infrastructure is absolutely vital, because infrastructure means connectivity. And today the world works through connectivity. So actually today, to have a functioning power generation and distribution system is absolutely essential, because people get connected, they get connected by technology. But you can't use the technology unless you have the electricity. Likewise, if you again look at the countries that manage to succeed, they make sure that they are connected to the world. They're easy to get to. When they get to a country, they're made to feel welcome, and the infrastructure is there to make that connectivity successful. Again, and fifth, education. You were right, that's what I said, education, education, education. Actually, when I said that, which I think was back in 1994 or 5, I would say over 20 years on, you can multiply its importance several times. Today, what is absolutely essential is that we educate our people to the highest possible quality. And in particular, we teach our young people to think creatively. Right? So it's not just a question of putting a whole lot of kids in a classroom. I mean, that you can do, and you can tick that box and say we've got the enrollment up. But it's teaching of quality. Now, here's the interesting thing. Around the world, I can think of states in India. I can think of different countries in the developing world, including some here in Africa, where they've reformed their education system and they've made real strides forward. Right? So those lessons are there and they can be learned. Likewise with healthcare, by the way. So how do you bring healthcare to developing nations? Very, very difficult when you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the qualified nurses and doctors and so on. But actually, again, around the world, some people are making it work. So how do you learn the lessons and how do you implement them? Agriculture. What we find so often in Africa is you get large numbers of people employed in agriculture, but the efficiency of the agricultural sector is such that you're still importing basic foodstuffs when all of the countries like Ghana should frankly be self-sufficient in everything they want and probably be exporting. But again, there are good ideas from around the world as to how agricultural programs can be made to be more efficient, how they can reach more people, how they can get produce, the factors of production up, and how therefore they can benefit the people. And then finally, just running through these things very quickly. So you need the right infrastructure around the decision maker. You need to get in the best ideas. And some of the areas that I've talked about are areas where, as I say, there's very good practice that you can learn from around the world. The final thing is what I addressed a little earlier in my remarks, which is the methods of implementation and delivery. Now, when I was in government, we pioneered, we changed the system of government at the center. We pioneered a concept which is called a delivery unit. And basically, what that was supposed to do was to take the absolutely core priorities of, in my case, the Prime Minister, but in this case it would be the President, and say, how do we make sure that those priorities are implemented, actually done, so that even though there may be 250 different things that the government's trying to do, these ones that are absolutely core to the success of the government are implemented. And so we created a structure that gave us what I call the 4 Ps. Okay? The first is a process of prioritization. And that's far harder than it sounds, by the way, because everything's a priority. You know, when I made my speech saying education, education, my top 3 priorities, education, 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 I'll never forget it. Next day, someone stops me and says, so does healthcare not matter then? It's a perfectly obvious response, but the point is, in the end, you have to prioritize. When I come across countries with a World Bank report that says, you know, Vision 2030, or I come across some that say Vision 2050, I just put my head in their hands. Because there's no way you're going to do all that. It might be absolutely, all of these things will be completely worthwhile, but you'll never manage to do it all. So, and one of the things you learn in government is how fast time passes. You know, before you know it, you're into the next election cycle. So you've got to be able to get that thing moving fast, and that requires prioritization. That's the first P. The second P is, once you prioritize, you've then got to get the right policy. You know, one of the things I learned again in government is for my first 2 or 3 years, if I had a priority, I would accept the system as it was, and then I used to come along and beat it over the head, the system, to make it work harder. And whilst I was beating it, by the way, it did work a bit harder. But when I stopped beating it, it stopped working. Right? So I realized that after a time, I was approaching this in the wrong way, that I had to get a policy that reformed the system, right? And that put in place the right incentives and structures that allowed that delivery to start what I would call self-perpetuating, okay? So that it wasn't, you didn't continually have to come back and make it happen. So you've got to prioritize, you've got to get the policy right. The third thing is, you know, there's a certain way in which government is like a business. Now, everyone always objects when you say that, because they say, no, I mean, the government's to do with the people, and business is to do with profit, and blah, blah, blah. Of course, in some ways, that's true. But in other ways, government is like a business. In other words, you can run it efficiently, or you can run it inefficiently. Right? So if you take something like procurement, okay, government goes and buys 100 tables, it's no different from a business buying 100 tables. They can buy them sensibly or they can buy them stupidly. Right? Now, you know, performance management is how companies deliver results. In other words, once they come to their ambition and they know what they're going to do, they then track it and monitor it all the way. So the other thing that we did with this delivery unit was kept on top all the time of our priorities, that what we said was supposed to happen was actually happening. And if it wasn't happening, we knew why it wasn't happening and we could go and correct. And then finally, which is absolutely a statement of the blindingly obvious, but it's amazing how people just in government particularly miss it, is personnel. You know, any organization is as good as its people. I mean, it's a cliche, but the reason it's a cliche is because it's true. And so that's those 4 Ps, which are prioritization, policy, performance management, and personnel. Those are the things that I think make the central government work or not. So anyway, this is what I, spend my time working on with different governments around the world. But, it's an interesting thing. The reason I brought everything together, because the Africa Governance Initiative is still going strong as the Africa Governance Initiative, but it's housed within one not-for-profit institute today. Because the different bits of work that I do, for example, in the Middle East, I want everything to be kind of brought together. But, the interesting thing is, as I've started to bring them together, you realize that all the problems are pretty much the same. And actually, in today's world, the most important thing is to have the imagination to go out and connect with what is excellent out there. And just to finish on this point, what I've learned, and it's a bit of a tragedy for politics, but I think it's a product of the way the world's changing and the way politics is such a fierce battle today. The actual reality is the best ideas about government are often not to be found in the narrow world of politics. And one of the things I think is really important, if I was back in government today, I would have a whole wing of my government that was like a great sort of permanent search party out there for the best ideas, wherever sector they come from. Could be the private sector, could be the voluntary sector. It can actually be in the faith sector. Right? There's lots of good thinking out there. So you just got to bring it in and try and harness it in such a way that government becomes more effective. But, Ghana's at a very important moment in its future now. You've elected a new president. I think he's come in with a, big weight of expectation. We'll obviously help in any way we can. But I think we're better able to succeed today as governments if we realize that governing itself has certain ideas and principles that are grown up now that we can draw upon so that we govern well and not badly, and then our countries prosper and don't fail. Thank you very much. Again, thank you to the Institute of Economic Affairs for hosting me today. I think I may have seen some of you earlier with the President. I'm delighted to be back in Ghana, delighted to be back in Accra. I'm here with my Africa Governance Initiative. We're very willing to do whatever we can to help Ghana at this important stage of its development with a new president, a new team. As you know, we work effectively on how you get implementation of priorities and policy and how you make a country better. We do this in about 8 different African countries now, and this is my passion.
You're on record to have said somewhere in 2015 that Africa is the most exciting continent on the planet because of its opportunities. right here in Ghana, how can we position ourselves? In fact, how best can we position ourselves to make the world realize our potential, to invest in Ghana, as well as help us accelerate job creation? Thank you.
Sure. So, you know, I've worked on Africa for a long time. When I was Prime Minister, and I was leader of the G8 nations. In 2005, we put Africa at the center of the G8. We created the Department for International Development. We trebled aid from the UK. But today, in my post-prime ministerial work, there's a different concept, which is a concept of how we help countries to take their own destiny into their own hands. And right now, Ghana, you know, has got big challenges for sure. Challenges around its budget deficit, challenges around the power sector, challenges around agriculture, education, industrialization. But there is an enormous amount of goodwill internationally towards Ghana today. The Ghanaian people are respected people. This country has huge potential. It's got resources that it can develop and exploit. And what is necessary is that it sets the country on the right path now to take the difficult decisions and to improve the lives of people. And if we can help from the governance initiative in any way with that process, we will. But I'm very confident about Ghana. I think the Ghanaian people should be confident about the country. And right now is the moment for understanding that potential and developing it, and knowing that whatever the challenges, there is a genuine opportunity if the correct decisions are taken and the right focus is there.
Thank you. Right, Araba.
Good evening, Mr. Blair. My name is Araba Kumson. I work for the Multimedia Group Limited, a mother company of Joy FM. And I'd like to stay on the issue of what you've been doing with AGI. You've been advocating for Africa to move away from its heavy reliance on aid to trade. And in fact, our president was out of the country in Geneva last week, also echoing the same point, that we need to move away from our heavy dependence on foreign aid. But I'd like to know your thoughts on this. How can we move away from aid if countries such as yours are protecting their markets from African products with trade barriers and subsidies and the like?
So, aid is important. And as I say, when I was Prime Minister, we trebled aid. But today you can learn the lessons of good governance from around the world. You know, for example, if you're trying to bring in investment, you need a minimum of bureaucracy, you need transparent rules, you need to make sure that you're fighting things like corruption, you need to make sure that you're developing the infrastructure so that business can come in. These are lessons that around the world where they're applied, countries succeed. And yes, of course, you've got to open up Western markets as well. And actually, Britain, which is still part of the European Union as we speak, you know, we have been advocating within Europe a much more open approach to African trade. So yes, of course, you need to knock down those trade barriers with the West. But by the way, you also need to knock down some of the trade barriers, tariff and non-tariff, between the neighboring countries. You know, there's so much more that could be done in the trade that goes across this part of Africa. So all of these things, what I'm saying is we kind of know what we should do. The challenge is doing it. And whatever sector you're talking about, industrialization, the power sector, agriculture, the great thing is to learn the best lessons from around the world, what's working, what's not, and apply those lessons.
Thank you. Right. Umaru Sandu.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Umaru Sandu. I'm with CTFM in Accra. You're welcome.
Thank you.
As a man who became the leader of the British government at age 43, I mean, first time in history since 1812. What advice would you give to Africans when they go to the polls to elect a leader? Would you advise a cap on the age a leader in Africa should resign their position, like you did? Thank you.
You know, funnily enough, as I get older, I'm less keen on that. I actually think you should elect the best person, you know, whether they're younger or they're older. With youth can come vigor, but with age can come experience. The best thing is to have vigor and experience, but I mean, I don't favor the age limit. I favor the right of the people to decide, and they should decide on the basis of the best person, whatever their age, whatever their gender.
Excellent. Thank you. Right. Who next? Wendy.
Good evening, sir. My name is Wendy Lai. I work with TV3. I would want to ask a question on NEPAD, because you're one person who really championed the cause of NEPAD and you believed in that very initiative. What do you make of the state of NEPAD now, and do you think that it's achieving its aim? Thank you.
Well, I think NEPAD was important because it articulated a principle which was one of partnership between, you know, the developed nations and developing nations. And it was important because it had a method of assessing whether people were making progress. So I think NEPAD has in part been successful. But, you know, I think we need to take the concept further. Germany, for example, in the G20 this year is looking at a compact for change and investment. And I think the best ideas today, whether NEPAD or other ideas, the best ideas are those that involve a partnership of equals between the developed and the developing world. You know, we've both got a lot to gain from that type of partnership, but ultimately, whether a country like Ghana succeeds will be up to Ghanaians. In the end, we can help. You know, the developed world can help, or it can hinder. And let's hope it helps. But ultimately, your success lies in your hands. You know, you will make your country succeed. No one else can be substituted for that. And that kind of principle of partnership rather than donor-recipient, you know, is, I think, the better way forward. And that's what was behind NEPAD. And, you know, I'm in favor of developing NEPAD further, but I think we should be looking at different ways of partnering.